Hello and welcome to the Problem Gambling podcast. I'm Barry Grant, an addiction counselor with Extern Problem Gambling. And my co-host, who's normally here, Claire Donegan, has the dreaded flu at the moment. So she had to bail last minute. So Claire, I hope you feel better soon. But our guest today is Andy May, who is a gambler in recovery. And we're delighted to have Andy on the line from Norfolk today. We've got mad storms here in Ireland. The storm Eowyn must be a Welsh uh, derivation of Owen or something like that, but it's been kicking Ireland's ass here today. Fortunately, we have power, we have broadband, so we're good to go, and hopefully everything in Norfolk is is
Yeah, we're all good.
relatively.
We're all good. Thanks for having me along, Barry. It is a bit windy, and hopefully the power stays on for the next hour, so we don't get cut off partway through. But we'll see how we do, mate.
Yeah, touch wood. Hopefully everything goes okay. So listen, Andy, thanks for coming on the podcast today. Do you want to just tell the listeners a little bit about, let's say, where you started off gambling? Like, what age were you when you gambled first? I mean, did you start off, like most people say, recreationally and it kind of gradually built over time? Or just give us a little background on
Yeah,
your
yeah,
own
yeah, sure.
experience.
Do you know what? Yeah, what my sort of background and my gateway into gambling is probably going to end up being a very similar story to ones that you've had on before. So grew up in a seaside town, amusement arcades, things like that. So got into going to the amusements and spending the pocket money or pocket change that I had, and seeing all of that as just like part of life because it was how it worked in this sort of area of the sort of the world. When I was sort of getting to adulthood, um, and getting into my early 20s when I could go to the bookies. So bear in mind, um, that was 20 odd years ago. So things like online gambling and stuff like that didn't exist at that point in time. So it was going to the betting shop and things like that. And sort of got into that with sort of older friends that I had at the time, and that kind of became the norm. Now, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and it's probably important to put a little bit of a sort of like caveat on the whole thing, which is my recollection of how all of this happened is like my recollection of it, and it's like one of these disclaimers that you get in a book. Sometimes what you think happened isn't necessarily how it did happen. So my recollection is that we used to go to the bookies like literally every Saturday morning and have a bet on the football. For having chats with sort of old friends and stuff like that. That isn't necessarily exactly how it did happen. That's how it ended up for me. But to start off with, we were going like to the bookies, every now and then having a bet on the football, going to the pub in the afternoon, watching the football scores come in, social, leisure, fun. You can use whatever words you want for it, but certainly not harmful. Over time, for me, what happened is that I then started, and this is where some of those recollections were a little bit hazy for me. I started doing that more frequently, and not with the friendship group that I was traditionally doing it with in a social way. So it would then become every Saturday, but every Saturday for me, and then it would become Saturday became a point in time when Saturdays kind of wasn't enough, and there were games on a Sunday, there were games on a Tuesday night, there were games on a Wednesday night, there were games on a Thursday night, whatever it might be, and I'd be sort of like cutting into the local bookies in the local town whenever I felt like it, as opposed to doing it with friends and as a pastime. Even then, I probably didn't think too much of it. To be fair, I just kind of thought, well, this is sort of like the new way. This is how it is. This is just something to do. And bearing in mind that I didn't really have any financial responsibilities, so I didn't have. I lived with my parents at that point in time. I didn't have much in the way of bills. So what I was earning, I could kind of spend on. In theory, you should be saving it, but I could spend it on pretty much what I wanted, I guess at the time, and so I didn't really see that as too much of an issue. But I think I think for me, and probably the same for a lot of the people that are listening, maybe for me, that started to ingrain sort of like behaviours within myself that became sort of normalised, that probably were even then were probably causing me harm, I suppose, and creating like these addictive sort of tendencies within me a little bit. Um, so that was, like I say, that was 20 odd years ago. So in terms of my own sort of personal story, that sort of developed to the point where I was working up the ladder in my career. So I was getting slightly better jobs. So I was able to earn a bit better money. I was able to take on credit cards and things like that. And in amongst all of that time, relationships start to develop, and I was with a partner at the time, and we were saving up for or essentially allegedly saving up for our first house together. Um, and like I say, the seeds had been sown for me, and I think by then I saw gambling as probably not a leisure activity as much then, and I saw it as a means to try and make money. And I thought it was my um, ticket to being able to afford more than I would just from my normal earnings kind of thing. And it's probably like you get this sort of compulsive stuff with a person, and I thought I was able to be shrewder than the bookies, and I was clever, and football was my sport, and I thought I knew everything about it, and if I thought a certain thing was going to happen in a game, it was guaranteed the God's honest truth that it would, and took me a long while to realise that the odd setters and the trading rooms and all that sort of stuff at the betting companies know a lot more about it than I do. Anyways, long story short, I guess we were saving up for a first house. I wasn't saving anything, and that situation came to a head when we were sort of about to sign the papers for the house, and I just didn't have the deposit that I was supposed to have had, and not least I didn't have the deposit, but I'd taken on some credit cards where I was chasing the loss that I was building. Digging that hole deeper, Barry. I guess more than anything, digging the hole deeper. And that was, like I say, that was a long while ago. That was that ended in 2007. So it was sort of 2006, 2007. So you're talking 14, 15 years ago or whatever. Everything came to a head. Family found out. No one could believe what I was doing. It was like shock to everyone. And I guess that the end of that chapter and the end of that sort of the piece that you asked about there, Barry, in terms of how I got into it. At that point, I kind of stopped. I did stop gambling. I promised that it wasn't going to happen again. I knew how much damage it had caused. And in 2007, at that point in time, I quit the betting, and I went down the road that a lot of people do in terms of like literally not buying a lottery ticket, not not doing anything at all that could be seen as gambling, for fear of my past behaviour. One of the things I always say when I'm talking about this is the one thing that I didn't do, and the one thing that we didn't do is I didn't try and do anything about it for myself. So I didn't try and didn't investigate the options of sort of going to meetings. Didn't even want to consider going to meetings to talk about my gambling. Didn't consider trying to get any help. Just went on the basis that it was something that had happened. It ended. We'd put it to one side, and we were trying our best to forget about it and sort of move on from it. And yeah, that was sort of my inroad to it. If that answers that part of the question for you, mate.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. I mean, what you described at the start is funny. I'm from a seaside town, not where I live now, but a place called Bray, which is to the south of Dublin, a seaside town. So, as with all seaside towns, they have a lot of arcades and slot machines and stuff like that. And a lot of people start off that way as young kids. Yeah. But yeah, you're like you were saying, kind of gambling recreationally with the friends, with the friend group. When you mentioned fuzzy memory, there's a great one of the best memoirs or autobiographies I've ever read was John Lydon's book, Johnny Rotten from the Sex Pistols.
Oh yeah, yeah.
No blacks, no dogs, no Irish is the name of the book. He has Irish roots, and he thing in the book where he tells a story, and then in the subsequent chapter, other people who were there, like Steve Jones, the guitarist in the Sex Pistols, tell the same
Tell the same
story,
story, and
but
it's different.
totally contradicts
Yeah,
everything that he said. It's such a great device to use it in a memoir. Anyway, but yeah, memory is a fuzzy and a complicated thing. But what you described, I've heard that story many, many times, and anybody in recovery might or even somebody in addiction might recognize that as well. That you start off, everybody's doing the same thing. It's you and your mates Saturday mornings. You might do your 5 or 10 football accumulator.
yeah,
Watch the soccer Saturday thing. I worked as a bartender for about 12 years. I always thought Soccer Saturday was the most boring television program on earth. Uh, but the purpose that it serves is it allows people with football accumulators to sit there and see how their bets are
yeah,
doing.
yeah. So, yeah, swear about the last minute goals or whatever it might be, and or the team that you knew that were going to win, and then it turns out they're playing. They've got half of the team missing, and they end up losing against the bottom of the table side or whatever. I traditionally used to pick favourites as well a lot of the time. It was like, yeah, that's a certainty, that's guaranteed, and I'd like string however many favourites together, and we all, many of us know nowadays that that is the least likely way of being successful in your betting one way or the other, just by nature of the way that the odds work and stuff. But at the time, you don't think like that, and you just think, I don't know. As an example, you just assume that Man City are always going to win at home, no matter what.
Yeah.
But that doesn't always happen. Um, so yeah, but
Yeah, and people don't like the odds of Man City winning at home either. So it's a less attractive bet because
yeah,
the odds are very short on that.
yeah,
But I mean, in terms of the progression, then you're talking about kind of peeling away from the pack. Like, so you and your friends are all doing the same thing starting off, but you did the
mm,
classic thing that a lot of people do is your friends might go every Saturday morning. Maybe they don't go every Saturday, and then you start going and then you're kind of going, well, I could duck in here on Tuesday because there's Champions League on a Tuesday,
yeah,
and
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
I'll do Tuesday, Wednesday. All totally feels normal. Again, could very well be within the parameters of recreational still,
yeah,
but you're doing something that your friend group aren't doing, and
yeah.
the social element kind of goes.
Yeah, and you start, so I know full well. So this isn't hazy. This is like the sort of things that I used to do. You know full well that you're starting to do things that they're not doing, or at least you perceive that they're not doing, um, and you try and cover like bits and pieces up in amongst that. So an example I give you, maybe Barry, would be filling your coupon on a Saturday morning, but doing it twice. So having one ticket that's a fiver and having another ticket that's exactly the same selections, but it's got 20 quid on it or something like that. And you hand them both over at the same time, get two tickets. So when you're in the pub looking at your tickets, you've got a 5 quid bet in your hand, but in your pocket you've got the same bet with a bigger stake on it and things like that. That sort of like you start getting that kind of like deceitful or just maybe not deceitful because you're not necessarily lying to them, but you're lying kind of to yourself a little bit. But you devious behaviours come into play because I think deep down you probably think that even then, hindsight is a wonderful thing, a phrase I use a lot of the time, looking back and realizing, how things looked or the behaviors and things. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, but you probably almost realize that you're doing something that's maybe a little bit wrong. And as soon as that kicks in, you kind of start wanting to hide it up, cover it up, not let people necessarily see that. So, like the whole going to the bookies on a like you're just saying, like on a Tuesday night or something like that. The thought process of being seen to be walking in the door or bumping into someone that you knew in there on a Tuesday night would be sort of like you wouldn't want that to happen. You'd want to be in and out as quick as you could, kind of thing. So you look back on things like that, and you can see how probably you were behaving in a bit of a weird way, even back then.
Yeah. So then it progressed then over time. Obviously, when you get to the point where you're kind of gambling the deposit for the home that you're planning to buy, like things kind of reach at a form of rock bottom. Obviously, that
Yeah,
there's a lot of different, what's the thing they say in 12-step meetings? That the elevator has a lot more levels on it that you can, you can go down to. And there's
Yeah,
an idea of a high bottom and a low bottom. And sure, in that moment, it felt like the ultimate rock bottom
yeah, yeah.
when you stopped in 2007. That's right, you stopped in
2007, yeah, in the
2007.
spring, yeah, yeah. And
Um,
it'd been it'd been a reasonably quick. If you use the elevator analogy there, it'd been a pretty quick descent. Things had gone down, between basically between probably the Christmas or so of 2006, Christmas spring 2006 through to 2007. It just went like real bad, real quick. And I think a lot of that is that whole chasing a loss and things getting worse, and you feel as though you're trying to you feel as though the only way out of it is to win your way out of it, and that's just like a false logic. Again, you don't know that until years after the event, but you're not going to win your way out of it, because at that point you are kind of you're addicted at that point. And if you do win anything, the chances are you're just going to think, well, I'll try and win some more. And it's a cyclical thing. But yeah, so that was, if I sort of carry on the sort of like where we got to a little bit. So that was spring of 2007. One of the things that happened in my own personal journey at that point in time, again, hindsight, look back, and probably it wasn't the right thing to have happened, but it did. It's a fact that it did. My parents basically said to me, look, we've got some money set aside, and we can try and solve this problem. We can try and sort out the deposit that you need for this house. We can deal with that later on. But if she's willing to give you a second chance, and you want to try and take your life forward here, and etc. etc., we'll help. For someone that's struggling with an addiction at that point in time, having financial help probably isn't the best thing to happen, because it's almost like sort of like wiping the slate clean to a certain extent. Again, you look back and it's what happened, and you can't deny that was the situation. But maybe I probably could have been better off if I'd have felt a bit more pain at that point, and had a harder journey at that point to get out of it. But basically, that was what happened. We went off and bought the house that we were planning on buying. I stopped gambling. Willpower alone didn't do anything to sort of address any of that. And I stayed off a bet for 7 years at that point. So I stayed off a bet until 2014. And then for whatever reason, Barry, and I look back on it now, and people often say why did you do this, or what made it happen, what made it start again. The truth is, you're never really going to answer the question, because you don't know. I've often said it was like maybe stress at work, feeling a little bit low, maybe in within myself for whatever reason. Gambling for me was like an escape, and for whatever reason, I decided I needed to escape from my like normal life at some point in 2014, and go back into this kind of fantasy world a little bit. So I had a lapse or a relapse at that point. Started off, with a £50 free bet. If you open an account with us, we'll give you a £50 free bet. At that point in time, God's honest truth, I didn't think there was any harm in what I was doing. I just thought to myself, well, it's a free bet, so what? It's not going to lead to anything. It's essentially free money, and it was a football match that I was betting on. It will make the game I'm watching a little bit more exciting. But it didn't take me very long. Within a few weeks, I was just back in a whole behavioural cycle of madness beginning again. And I'd gone at that point from just living what would have been like the cleanest, sensiblest, normalist life. Just like I had a couple of kids in that window of time between 2007 and 2014. So I was living a family life, nothing sort of like extravagant going on, nothing super duper about our lives, but we were living a happy, normal, family sort of life. For whatever reason, I tried to escape out of some of that somewhere. And as no doubt you'll have spoken to plenty of people in the past, if you go back into it and go back at it, you probably aren't going to go back at it at the £5 on a Saturday morning situation. Is going to be probably start where you left off. And obviously by this point in time, at the tail end of my gambling, or in the first period that we were talking about there, online was then a thing. So online gambling had become a thing. The smartphone was sort of either out or around about that sort of time. It was nearly out. I'd forgotten about one type of betting the other day until I was talking with a friend about some of these things. I'd forgotten that you used to be able to phone up and place your bet. So you'd have like a telephone account, and I used to have an account with a British bookie, and you'd phone your bets up. So you didn't, at that point, I've discovered a way of not going into the shop. I could just pick the phone up. I won't mention the name of the firm, but because it's sort of irrelevant, but you'd pick the phone up, call the 0800 number or whatever it was, and you could have 50 quid on whatever you wanted on that particular moment in time, whether that be football, horses, whatever. So I've discovered that somewhere in amongst it as well. But the online thing was like a big change for me, because it basically just meant you could do it wherever you wanted. You didn't have to make that journey in the town and sort of sneak around in quite the same way. So I went back down the rabbit hole, went down there pretty quick, got myself into a whole load of financial trouble pretty quickly. Realized relatively quickly that if anyone found out about it from a family point of view, I was in a whole load of trouble. That was probably going to be relationship over because of the history. You've done it again. Can't believe it. You said you weren't going to. You've done it again. So I just didn't know what to do, and everything just became very chaotic. I started spending all the money that I'd got, and then eventually, when I'd ran out of money, and this is sort of where sort of my story then kicked on into another sort of chapter, or however you want to look at it. But when I ran out of money, and I couldn't see a way of borrowing any money from anywhere, my credit cards were maxed out at this point. The credit file was shot to pieces. I was probably doing the things that lots of people you've had on before have probably done as well. I was chasing around looking for the postman when he was delivering the mail to make sure that the credit card bills didn't get into the wrong hands of the wrong people at home. All that sort of stuff. You look back on it, it's absolute, it's crazy, it's madness, and you kind of can't believe how much energy and effort you put into like keeping this thing going. But I did do that, and then like I say, when I ran out of money, by then I'd got a decent job, and I had a company credit card, and I started to abuse that company credit card to fund my gambling. Split second decision. I suddenly thought I need some money to gamble with. It was a Friday afternoon. I haven't got any money. I'm down to the bare bones in my bank account. I'll use my company card and I'll find a way of trying to cover it up. So at the time it probably was going to be, sorry, I did get some cash out, and I didn't mean to use my company card, and I must have just put it in the machine by mistake, and I'll pay it back, kind of thing. And that was probably my thinking at the start, and thinking that I could probably win some money to keep the gambling going off of that state. But the truth is, I lost that in the afternoon that I drew it out of the machine, and then it just started a vicious cycle of taking what wasn't mine to fund my addiction, and I did that over a period of 4.5 years roughly. Continued to abuse every level of trust that I had, either at home or at work. Came up with ever more ridiculous excuses when I look back on it as to why we'd needed to spend money at the place that I work, why we'd had to pay someone something on the last minute on Friday afternoon. By then I'd come up with ways of like not just using cash, but paying money into my own accounts and stuff like that. And just kept doing it over and over. Somewhere in amongst that, I think there were periods of times when there were certainly periods of time when I might win some money and thinking, oh, I can if I can just win enough here, I can change it all around. Did I ever withdraw any money to try and do that? No. Um, I just then spend it again on the same thing. Like I say, that went on for 4.5 years, roughly. Eventually, I got caught at work. That I think that had to happen sooner or later, no matter what. The truth is, by the time that I got caught, I think I'd had enough. And I think maybe if I wasn't feeling it consciously at the time, my subconsciousness was saying, "You can't keep doing this. This has got to end." And you almost need to get caught with this. So I took some money, I took some money at a time of the year when I knew that it'd probably get spotted with an audit, and it did get spotted quite quickly within a few weeks, and that kind of, I suppose, that uncovered a situation, and then that situation then unravelled over a period of time. The short version of that sort of chain of events, Barry, more than anything, the short version is that I ended up going to prison for a period of time off the back of that. So police came to see me a while after I'd left the business. They explained that there was a fraud at the company that I'd worked for. And I was then, after a period of time, I was then charged with fraud, went to court, magistrates court, various Crown Court things off the back of that, and then was sentenced to 4 years in prison in June 2021. At an age, I think I was 44 at the time, 44, maybe 45 when I went to prison, at an age when, bottom line was I've never been in any kind of trouble with any sort of like legal situation ever in my life, So I was like a fish out of water. It's like, what the hell was going on? But that was the consequence of what I'd done. And that was, that was the next part in that journey, I guess.
Yeah, okay. There's a lot. There's a lot in there to unpick and unpack. So it's 7 years of, like, in the 12, I'm not a fan of this term, but like in the 12-step meetings, they might call it white knuckling, where people are,
Yeah,
they're off a bet, or in AA they have a term. I think we've mentioned this before on the podcast, dry drunk. So the person does not drink alcohol anymore. So check, that's a box ticked.
yeah.
You're in recovery from your alcohol problem, technically, right? Because you don't drink anymore. But
You could put it in
you're,
inverted commas and say you think you're cured.
yeah,
Problem's
yeah,
gone away, you're fixed.
but you're not working on yourself, and you're not in recovery. You're not working on your recovery. You're abstaining.
Yeah.
You're
I
abstaining,
wouldn't
which is an important.
at that point in time, I wouldn't even have known what recovery meant. Um, it was just like I can't do this thing anymore, and I've never heard the phrase white knuckling before, but yeah, it makes complete sense. It's like just hanging on for dear life kind of thing, and trying to prevent that thing happening again, but doing nothing to prevent it happening again.
Yeah, and I look at that's just one perspective, and I'm not saying that that's my opinion of what you're doing, but
Mm.
that's there are some kind of concepts around there in the recovery space around that. Because like the other thing is there are probably more people who give up by themselves without ever going to a support group,
Mhm.
12-step meeting, counselor, residential treatment, or any kind of service than all
Yeah,
those things combined, right?
yeah,
So, but we don't have any data on them because they don't interact with any
yeah,
services, right? So, like, there are probably millions of people around the world who get into recovery from some sort of an addiction that we don't know anything about, and they could be doing really well, and they could be doing their own version of recovery, and it could be all perfectly good. We don't know, right? But I suppose from your own perspective, do you feel, I mean, this version of recovery where you are now, do you think you're doing it differently? Do you think you're doing it better this time around?
just back in 2007, yeah, guys,
Yeah.
it's like a different world. My eyes were opened up to what was out there in um, there or thereabouts the summer of 2020, which was when it was the first time that I'd done anything to try and get any help. So I literally just phoned the National Gambling helpline in the UK and thought I need to do something. And had a chat with them. They referred me on to a service in the UK with something called Break Even, probably a name that you'll be familiar with, and some of your listeners might be as well. So they referred me on to Break Even. I spent some time speaking with a sort of practitioner there for a good number of months, trying to start to try and piece it all together and figure some of it out, figure the underlying stuff out a little bit, and then gradually, and amongst that, I think my mind shifted a little bit, and I realised that I needed to research things a little bit more and try and I've been using the internet for years for gambling. I might as well start Googling gambling support and various things. And I got on social media and things like that, and was gradually finding lots of other people that had been in quite similar situations. I think there was this shift somewhere in amongst that period of time. There was this shift where I felt like I was the only person that ever could possibly have been going through what I was going through, feeling in the way that I was feeling, had behaved in the way that I'd behaved, and had done the things that I'd done. Like I was talking about, like the whole chasing the postman round or whatever, or stealing to fund your habit or your addiction and that. And I thought that no one else would have been doing that kind of stuff. And then when I started to outwardly look for people, kind of discovered that there were loads of people that had done that and had done basically the same things. The only difference was maybe the period of time, trying to sort of steer away from talking about money too much, but the amounts of money might have been different. The consequences may have been different. Not every case of someone with a gambling addiction ends up with them going to prison, but it could end up with just as serious or maybe even more serious outcome that is not nice. So gradually started to discover there was a whole world of people out there that had either been through it, or families that had been through it, or whatever it might be, and tried to start connecting with people. That whole the opposite of addiction is connection, that sort of phrase that people use, and started to try and build my own support network. And that, all of that was like the game changer for me. It meant that I knew that there were places to talk to people, places like safe places where you could go and speak about how you were feeling, and you weren't going to be judged because the people you were speaking to knew exactly how you were feeling pretty much because they'd felt it felt it themselves before, and that just all of that just changed everything for me, completely.
Yeah, and that would be more, I suppose, what might conventionally be considered, say, recovery, where you have a support network, you're finding your connection with others who are in similar situations. I like that. I mean, just on this show alone, we've had numerous people who have done very, very similar things, including our former co-host Tony O'Reilly, is
Yeah.
in very similar situations, although involved.
I wrote, as it happens, Barry, I wrote to Tony before I actually went to jail, and just I found his email somewhere, or found a social media account, and exchanged a sort of a letter, basically just saying, I've read about you, and this is kind of me, and this is what's going on. And had some nice supportive words back at the time as well. So you build that kind of, you start to, or you can, if you want to, you can start to build connections and gain some kind of sort of peer type support, and that means a lot to a person, because it showed me, even right back then when everything was like really, really bad, you're just about to go to prison, or you're soon to go to prison, and you don't know what that's going to look like, or how you're going to get through it or anything, but you get this, you can get this level of hope that you can see people that have actually been through exactly the same stuff, and as far as you can tell, it looks like they're doing okay. So it's like, well, if he can do it, then I can do it. If she can do it, then I can do it. If they manage to get through it, that if that family managed to get through it, then I think my family can get through it. And you start to um, even when it's really, really dark, you start to see, potentially a light at the end of the tunnel where you can think, if I can try and do the same things that some of these people are doing, then maybe there's a chance that I can get past this. And I suppose that's sort of what I ended up doing, to be fair. Just trying to make the most of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is important to have those kind of role models out there. And that's a big part of the reason why we do this podcast is to kind of normalize things a bit, get men and women on and say, look, this was my experience. And the more you hear, I suppose as a counselor, I hear a lot of people's experiences and I hear the overlap and the similarities between a lot of people's stories. The more, you as an individual, say the person listening to this podcast, if they're in addiction or they're in early recovery or they're working on their recovery, can go, oh, yeah, I did that and I did that. And I was chasing the postman, and there's people who paid the postman not to deliver the post or had it delivered to a friend's house. The story, once you start hearing, the more stories you hear, the more you go, oh, yeah, okay, lots of people do this, right? I'm not the only person
Yeah.
in the world who does this. Lots of people do this, right?
I remember.
Millions of people around the world do it. Everybody's an individual, and we're all individuals at the end of the day, but human nature is pretty predictable,
Yeah.
which is something that the gambling industry figured out a long
Yeah.
time ago.
Yeah.
Right? It's pretty predictable, and if you put people in certain situations, they're likely to behave in certain fairly predictable
I
ways.
remember just another little example. I'm only saying this because it's so ridiculous, Barry, but it might be that someone else has done the same type of thing. I remember pulling the wires out of the back of the broadband router at home and saying the internet was, our internet line must be broke. There must be something wrong with it, which basically meant that we couldn't check the online banking at a point in time when I didn't want to check it. And I managed to keep that pretense up for probably, I don't know, 2 or 3 months or something crazy. Um, that was at a period of time when you didn't have like, your Netflixes and stuff like that. So people weren't watching stuff on, over the internet all the time. So it was literally just to browse and to, Google things or whatever. But I managed to keep that up for however many months because I didn't want to log into the online credit cards and things like that, or I didn't want people to see them, should I say. So it's mad the things that you do. It's mad the things that you do, but you do them.
Yeah. And look, you're not alone in doing them, right? This
Yeah,
this is
yeah,
the important thing. Like
yeah,
this
absolutely.
is
Yeah,
it's not like you or anybody else with a gambling problem or addiction is some sort of weird anomaly. Like, you put people in these situations. I've often said, you drag random person X off the street and you expose them to enough of this stuff and put them in situations where might have an early big win. They get the buzz from that. So this is amazing. I want that feeling again. Also, I
yeah,
like the free money. Thanks very much. We start repeating because it was enjoyable, like anything else, cocaine, alcohol, you name it. If it's enjoyable, you're more likely to repeat it. So you
yeah,
go again. But you're more likely to lose money than to win money. That's why there's a gambling industry.
yeah,
It's how they make the profit. Everybody knows that at some level. So you lose more money than you're winning. You don't like that feeling. You will occasionally win, but you recycle your winnings and you do all the things that are super predictable. You listen to other people's stories. It's very, very, very similar patterns of behavior. Again, the industry relies heavily on people doing these very predictable things, and that's how they make their money, or
yeah.
part of how they make their money. But anybody can fall into that trap. I don't care who you are. I don't care what kind of walk of life you come from, what socioeconomic group, what your educational attainment levels are.
Yeah.
Right? You boil us down, we're pretty predictable and we're all very similar. We're all
The
known to
thing as
behave
well,
the same.
the thing with the gambling as well, more than anything else, and I sort of say this when I'm talking to people like in the workplace about addiction and stuff like that. I do a few sort of talks with the firm that I work for now, and you talk. So if you're talking to someone about drugs and alcohol, being the two other sort of primary things that people talk about in terms of addictions and stuff like that, there's only so much booze you can pour down your neck, or so much cocaine you can stiff up your nose before you're going to keel over, or people are going to see quite obviously what you're doing, and it's gonna, it's gonna come sort of crashing down around you in a roundabout sort of way. And again, you know this anyway, but the very obvious and clear difference with the gambling is no one can see what's going on. So the only limiting factor really is how much money you can spend, and that's probably the only fundamentally that's probably the only difference between my story and someone else's story. It just so happened that I was able to get hold of a whole load of money, and I didn't care at that point in time. And that's what you do. If I'd have worked in a garage or something like that, or whatever it might be, if I worked in the checkout on a supermarket, I would have been dipping the till. But it would have just been a means to an end.
Yeah, and you mentioned numbers earlier on. I don't want to get into numbers, and because either particularly, I mean, people can Google it. There's a few kind of newspaper reports if they want to see what kind of amounts you're talking about. But
The point is it's irrelevant, is the
yeah,
point.
it is irrelevant. That's the point I was about to make. And Tony has always said this, and we repeat it ad nauseum on the show, because if you're on a social welfare payment and you're losing half of that every week, or whatever chunk of it every week, that could be a relatively small amount of money. It could be £50, €50.
But it can be life changing.
But that could be the difference between the electricity bill getting paid or not, rent getting paid or not, you getting enough food or not, you getting important medication, really, really important things could be severely adversely impacted by relatively small amounts of money.
Yeah.
So that is important. Like, we always say that when there's large sums involved, like in your situation or in Tony's case or other people that we've had on the show, it's not about the number of zeros. It's
Correct.
about the impact that it's having on your life,
Yeah.
and the lives of your loved ones or people that you care about. So that's really important. I mean, in terms of, because I was looking at some of the newspaper articles, and they kind of, the Guardian would do this because they kind of have their own slant on the gambling industry, which is fair. I mean, they're not reporting anything that isn't factual, I think. But they would have looked at, say, some of the gambling companies that you would have gambled with online, and whether or not they intervened at any point, and how long it took them to intervene, and so on. I mean, you went to prison, you got a 4-year sentence. Did you serve 2?
That's right, yeah.
Right, yeah. So I mean, you were culpable. I don't think you're trying to make out that you're in any way not responsible for the things that you did. You put your hand up and you're responsible, and you've served your time in prison. And obviously, there are knock-on effects from I worked for an ex-prisoners project for years. Like, paying your debt to society doesn't end when you walk out the prison gates, because you have a criminal record there indefinitely in some cases. So I suppose the question, long-winded question I was going to put to you is, like, obviously you're culpable and you were found guilty in a court of law, and you were sent to prison, and you paid that debt, and probably to some degree continue to pay that debt to society. Do you think that there's any level of culpability or dual culpability, or a proportion, even some tiny percentage of culpability that could or should or might be laid at the feet of online gambling companies who have massive amounts of data, who can clearly see when people are spiraling, who would have a pretty good idea what a person earns as well? And if they're gambling within their means, or even just on basic money laundering legislation, even if we took the problem gambling side of it out, similar with Tony O'Reilly's situation, Paddy Power in that instance would have had anti-money laundering legal obligations to say, where's this money coming from? What's the story? Any thoughts on that? I don't want to get into bookie bashing necessarily.
No, you won't get that from me at all, Barry.
Yeah.
You won't get that from me. If you'd asked me the same question a few years back, you would have done. But my view on these things has developed and evolved over time. Like I say, if you'd have asked me this question in, I don't know, 2020, I would have said it's not my fault. It's all their fault. None of this is down to me. They let me do it. Ask me the same question now, and I take responsibility for my actions. So I see it as I was the one that was doing the things that I was doing. Um, I think I've used the sort of phrase, I was the one that was pulling the trigger. I had the gun with the bullets in it, and I was pulling the trigger. Um, so to that extent, it's on me, and I've not always seen it that way. Sorry, but nowadays that's how I always try and see it. Doesn't necessarily cut the same way for some people. Some people see it very differently, and I get that, and I accept that. Um, Even family members of mine probably were saying, yeah, you did do wrong, but look at all of this advertising that's out there. Look at all of the coercion that's going on. How did they allow it to happen? And I can see that as well. If I, but I don't necessarily, and I think you maybe just touched on it in amongst your question. I don't necessarily see it as um, just the fault of the gambling industry. Um, I think banks have a big place to play in it.
Yeah.
So a lot of the money that I spent was what the phrase washed through a credit card, whatever the word you want to use, laundered through a credit card. So I was stealing money onto my personal credit card, and using that credit card to then move the money onwards to betting sites and stuff like that. A lot of this was before the credit card ban was in place, so you could do that.
Yeah.
There was a point in time when it became more difficult to do that because of the credit card ban, but it didn't mean that it was impossible to do it. But the credit card company knew my salary at the time because I declared that when I took the credit card out originally when I was living a normal, traditional life. And then at some point in amongst it, they could see huge amounts of money going through that credit card on a weekly basis. Their systems should be capable of picking that up and flagging it and saying, look, we've got something going on here and we need to raise, I think they call it a suspicious activity report in terms of fraud. We need to be raising a suspicious activity report, getting this looked into. So there's a whole raft of places that probably could have done better and probably could do better and maybe would nip things in the bud a little bit quicker. Certainly in terms of again, not going back to sort of money and stuff too much, but in cases where there are bigger amounts of money involved, they should have the tools to pick that up. It doesn't mean it's their fault that a person is still doing it, but they should be able to nip it down quicker. I read, I forget which paper it was in, but I read a story just recently where there was again huge amounts of money involved, and it was quite recent. It was a case that I think the guy was still gambling up until 2021, which is just a few years ago. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I thought things had improved. I thought stuff had got better. And then you ask yourself the question: has it? Because it still seems to be going on. There's a long answer to your question. I take responsibility for my actions. I think that with a fair wind, some people could be doing a bit more to try and reduce some of these things. And without getting into too much of a rant and a rave about it, I think the regulator should be doing a hell of a lot more to make some of that happen. And that's where I'm at with it nowadays.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, look, gambling companies are gonna compete to take as much money off their customers as humanly possible. That's the reason for their existence, right? So I mean, to expect them to behave otherwise is probably a little bit naive. But to expect them to meet their legal and regulatory obligations, I don't think is unreasonable. I think that should be. So I mean, if the regulator or the regulators, because it's a global industry, around the world, have robust regulations in place, I think that's probably the best way to go. Conscious of the time there, Andy. I mean, in terms of so you're in recovery 2.0, and it's a very different kind of recovery this time around. I mean, what do you think has helped you the most? I think I read that you did 6 months in a closed prison and you were like 23 hours a day
That's
locked
right.
up
Yeah.
and stuff
So
like that.
yeah,
And then went to an open prison where you were able to
yeah,
go out to Gamblers Anonymous meetings from the open prison. Is that right?
mhm,
Is that where it
yeah,
would
that's
have
right. Yeah,
started?
yeah, yeah. So the first GA meeting that I ever went to was when I was a serving prisoner. So the governor at the prison that I was at, I managed to catch him on a good day, and I asked if he'd give me permission to be allowed out on license. So like on a what would be seen as called ROTL, release on temporary license. If I'd be allowed to go down to the local GA meeting, it turned out it was literally about 30-minute walk from the prison, if that. And he agreed to it, which looking back, he could quite easily have said no. He could have quite easily said, "No, I'm not going to let you go down into the city centre at 10 or until 10 o'clock at night on a weekday evening. There's too much risk there. If I know that you're not going to do anything wrong, but if something happens, if an incident happens and you happen to be present or involved at that time, it could look bad on them." Um, but he allowed that to happen. So that was the first thing. I started to engage with various support charities and stuff. So one of the ones, probably one of the articles that you may have read, I started spending time talking to people at Epic Restart Foundation.
Yeah.
Uh, that was huge for me. That opened up a whole load of, do you know what, you can actually put yourself back together here if you try and I know we're pushed a little bit for time, but the simplest way of looking at it for me is, if you try and do the right things, whatever the right things are, but if you're trying to live a sensible and healthy sort of life, if you can consistently keep trying to do the right stuff, then that's probably going to only benefit you and help you to push on in life. So I spent time talking with people like that. Looking at my life and assessing where I was at with various things. Looking at, there's a thing you'd probably be familiar. There's a thing called a well-being wheel, or we call it a wheel of life or well-being wheel or whatever. And you look at various aspects of your life and mark yourself out of 10. And that, for me, that was and is an exercise that I can look at, a wide range of things that are going on in my life, and try and figure out where I might be a little bit behind, and then try and figure out what I might be able to do to try and edge myself up a little bit. One of the things I was thinking about the other day as well a little bit was, it's not just the trying to get your relationships back on track or whatever it might be, or trying to get your career back on track, or whatever it might be. It's also the amount of time that you put into each of these things as well, and I think that's quite important to me nowadays. So it's like, if I spend all of my time focused on just one thing, then the other things are probably going to go by the wayside. So if I spend all of my time, um, I don't know, focusing on my career maybe, and trying to get on in that, then probably my relationships with my family are probably going to suffer potentially, because I'm not spending enough time talking to my parents, or spending enough time with my kids or whatever. So for me, it's like trying to balance it all out. Hopefully that kind of makes sense to yourself and anyone that's listening there a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a worksheet similar to that called the lifestyle balance wheel that I would use. And it's basically,
Right.
it's just a circle, and you go, okay, what slice of this pie is work, and what
Yeah.
slice of the pie is time with your family, and what slice of the pie is self-care, and what slice of the pie
Yeah.
is exercise and friends and whatever. But you decide what are the important things, or what are the things that you currently kind of put your time and energy into. And quite often I would do with people starting off, well, what slice of the pie is your gambling at the moment? If they're still gambling day one when they get into recovery, and that could be almost all the pie. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it'll be almost every waking moment, and all the other really important things with their health and their family and their work and all these other things. They're attending work 8 hours a day, but they're not there. They're just kind
Yeah.
of phoning it in and doing the minimum, and they're spending time with their kids and their spouse and their partner, but
But they're not really
really
there.
they're not
Yeah.
really there.
Yeah. Yeah. You
So,
start putting all that down on one other thing to me as well. Start putting it all down on paper, and it becomes a bit more real as well. You can think about it. You can sort of like think I'm spending all of my time gambling, or I'm spending all of my time on X, Y, Z, whatever it may be. But when you put it down on a little bit of paper and start looking at it, it's the same as I sort of make lists of like things that I need to be doing nowadays and like what my priorities are and stuff like that. You put it down on a little bit of paper and it sort of means a bit more because you can sort of like see it and it's like a bit more real. And it's, maybe it's something you can hold yourself to account against a little bit. It's almost like I said I was going to do this and have I done it or not? Well, I haven't, so it's going to have to stay on a bit of paper now because I'm going to have to do it next week. Just little bits like that. That's kind of how I try and I suppose how I try and live my life a bit more nowadays in that sort of way. I think we were talking about prison a little bit earlier, and I think as much as prison's not a nice place to be, and I can't say that I particularly enjoyed it because I didn't, but I think it did teach me a little bit of structure. Even though there was certainly when I was in like closed conditions, there was like more or less nothing to do and nothing going on, but it gradually started to teach me a little bit of structure in my life, and I kind of quite like that as well. A bit more routine, sensible routine. But maybe that doesn't work for everyone in prison either, though. So,
yeah, but I often say to people that I'm working with in counseling like that, in prisons it tends to be quite a structured regime now. I mean, in a situation where you're locked in the cell for 23 hours a day, you've only got your hour a day to get out of it and have a routine there. But I suppose in other maybe more liberal prison settings, you have your meals outside the cell. You might have gym time. You might have a class that you're going to. There could be an AA meeting or an NA or a GA meeting, and all these different things within the prison system. And people's days are very, very structured, and it suits everybody. It suits the prison officers because they want people as structured as possible, but it suits the prisoners as well. They're coming quite often from a life of chaos out in the real world.
It kind of teaches a little bit of gives you a little bit of responsibility and ownership of what you need to be doing as well. Because if like the GA thing is a perfect example. So if I didn't hand the right piece of paper in with the right details on every single week, I wouldn't be going. So the onus is on you to do the things that you need to be doing to I suppose receive or be rewarded with the things that you're wanting to get. So if you didn't talk to the right person or hand the right sheet of paper in or whatever it might be, it just wasn't going to happen. Someone was going you're going to walk into the office and they're going to say, well, you're not on the list, so you're not going anywhere. Stay here kind of thing. So it sort of teaches you a little bit of like personal responsibility, I suppose, a little bit as well, maybe, which is a good thing because you can take that forward into how you then sort of live your life there afterwards.
Yeah, no, definitely a big fan of putting things on bits of paper. Sorry for killing all the trees, but I'm a fan of doing it that way. I know there's loads of apps and loads of digital ways you can do it, but I'm still a big fan. Or a whiteboard, I'm just going to have it there. And like that, if it's in the kitchen, if it's housework stuff or whatever, you're accountable to everybody else in the family. You say, no, well, it was your turn to do the thing. It's on the list. Do it. And you have that internal pressure to get the things done as well. And there's a lot to be said for good old-fashioned, boring self-discipline, routine, structure. Like these things do work well for most people most of the time. There's a lot of mental and physical health benefits to them. Okay, well, Andy, listen, thanks so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it. It's an amazing story, and I suppose, just briefly, just wanted to touch on the relapse as well because that is so important, and for people to watch out for. People, sometimes I'll get people getting back in contact with me that I worked with 4 or 5, however many years ago, and like that, they were kind of maybe got complacent and they're thinking, sure, I've got this thing under control. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen? And getting my 50 quid free bet or whatever the offer is. I'm not even gambling with my own money, and it'll be a bit of fun. This time I'm going to have it under control. This time it's going to be different. And then, like they'd say in the 12-step meetings about relapse, that quite often, well, more often than not, you don't get back on where you get off. So when people, if it took you X amount of years to get to a really kind of out of control spiral place, the first time around, like the second time around after the relapse, like the time to get to a really out of control place can be really short.
Yeah.
Like people can really start to spiral really quickly.
Which is essentially what happened with me, to be fair, Barry. So I'll give you a little example. I know we are pushed a tiny bit, but as you've done like a little bit of reading and stuff, I have done a few articles here, there, and whatever. And I did a thing about a year or so back. It was New Year's Day, I think they printed it. And a journalist asked me a question. And I think the journalist question was something along the lines of, do you think you could ever gamble again? I think was the question that they used.
Mm.
And it was a written piece. And my answer to that was, I think I said, unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. Someone wrote to me a little bit after, a random person I didn't know wrote to me afterwards. You know, your behaviour was disgusting. I can't believe that you did this and you stole money and whatever. But furthermore, I can't believe that when asked if you would gamble again, you answered yes to the question. And then I had to try to sort of like explain my answer, but essentially I was saying, look, I don't know if I'm going to gamble again. I really, really, really don't want to. But the truth is, because I know I've got this thing and I know that I've lapsed before, the answer has got to be, I could do. As the answer has or had to be to that question, yeah. I could do that. And the long and the short of it is that you then spend all of your days and all of your time making sure that you do all of the right things to not do that. And that's, I suppose that is a lesson learned after a period of 7 years abstinence and then falling off the horse or falling off the wagon, whatever you want to look at it. I suppose you sort of learn that from that, but it's like it's in you, and you've just got to manage it.
Yeah, and actually, I read that article this morning, and when I read it, my reading of it was exactly the way you just explained it there. That not that you had a desire to gamble again or that you planned to gamble again,
Yeah.
but that
But you might.
you
Yeah.
could relapse, right?
Yeah.
And that's the reality of it. Like anybody in recovery from any sort of addiction can relapse, and I suppose that's why maintaining one's recovery is important rather than just going, well, I'm X amount of years off a bet, therefore I'm cured, quote
I think you
unquote.
use the word complacency
Yeah.
is to back, and that's like that's the biggest demon of all of it. If you become complacent anywhere in amongst it, then you only need to be in a moment of vulnerability at some point in time when things maybe aren't going quite as well as you want them to be, or the stars have aligned and you've ended up with, I don't know, some money in your pocket that you hadn't planned to have there, and a situation suddenly manifests itself. And if you're not in the right mind sort of place at that point in time, who knows what can happen. So you just have to keep. It's really boring, but it's just like rinse and repeat the same stuff. I'm going to do this. I'm going to try and get to a meeting this week or whatever it might be. And just keep on doing those things. If you're looking for a tip, anyone that's listening in still, if you're looking for a tip, that would be my tip. Just keep trying to do it, trying on doing the right stuff all the way through. Never give in on it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's great advice, and we'll leave it there for today. But just like that, if it's working for you, keep doing it. Right?
Yeah.
Keep doing
Yeah,
it. Don't get complacent.
yeah.
Don't stop doing the things that are helping you in your recovery. Keep doing them. Andy, listen, thanks so much for taking the time to come on today. I really appreciate it. And
That's a pleasure.
it's an amazing story, and like that, unfortunately, many people, steal or engage in fraud to fund their gambling addiction. It's far too common and far too prevalent. It happens to a lot of people. You're certainly not alone there. I'm sure there are people listening to the podcast today who've done it. And like that, you've gone through the prison system. You've done your time, and I really wish you the best in your recovery now this time around, because it's a horrible situation to have to go through, and like that, you know, I'm probably more inclined to push you bookie bash than you are. But if you put it back to the regulator, and if you put it back to the banks and say, okay, like somebody needs to have some guardrails in there, whoever it is, the most
Yeah,
responsible people in the room, which probably is not the bookies.
correct. That's kind of the way I see it anyway. That's the way I see it.
Yeah.
I think without trying to open up that conversation again, I think they'll get away with what they can get away with for as long as they can, and it comes down to um, trying to stop that a little bit. So,
Yeah, well, listen, fair play for kind of coming out and telling your story as well, because like a lot of people don't want to, which is natural. Enough people want to kind of
yeah.
keep their story to themselves. So thanks again, Andy
No, it's
May.
a pleasure.
Really
Thanks for
appreciate you
having me.
coming on, and take care and goodbye, listeners, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye bye.